Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth already in the 10 sessions of MarshWatch. I can't believe how fast this always goes. Next thing you know it, we're halfway through the webinar series. So I'm excited to get started for this evening. I'd just like to share with you that I'm joining from Saskatoon, and we're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the homelands and the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. For those of you who might be joining for the first time, because we still have people registering for the webinar series, my name is Leanne Laftremoy, and I have the pleasure of working for Birds Canada. We're a national not-for-profit. I'm based in Saskatoon, and we have a mission to conserve, or to drive action to conserve birds. We want to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds in Canada. And this is a little montage of me in some of my most favorite habitats. I really, really love wetlands, and they're kind of my happy place. And they're also one of the really neat places on the landscape because they really attract and draw in all kinds of things. Everything needs a drink of water, so you'll get mammals running through them and all kinds of birds and things that'll feast on, the insect blooms that happen that, aren't traditionally wetland associated species, but they're going to be eating, the byproducts of having wetlands around. So they're cool places and I love them dearly. And I've worked for Birds Canada for quite some time now. I first started in 2008 as a summer technician surveying least bitterns in Southern Ontario. So been at this for a little bit and I do love it. Okay, on the agenda for this evening, we're just doing some birds and amphibians. That's going to be recorded and posted online. And then we'll shut the recording down and then we will do the quizzes and we can get into whatever discussions you feel like discussing. And you can also, go online and do some of the quizzes. They're not the same, they're a little bit different. So if you're watching a recording of this, you can go ahead and go to the MarshWatch webpage and check out the quizzes as well. Okay, on the menu for this evening, we've got a couple of teal. So these are itty bitty small dabbling ducks. These are the puddle ducks that wander around and, um, you know, go on land. They don't dive under the water so much. We've got blue-winged teal and green-winged teal. We do have two expert divers. We've got the horned grebe and the eared grebe. We've got the Wilson snipe, black tern, and our frogs this evening, we've got the spring peeper and tree frogs. We've got two types of tree frogs and they're very closely related, but we'll talk about that once we get to the tree frog session. Okay, first up, we've got the very, very handsome blue-winged teal. It is very aptly named. Both sexes have this powdery blue patch on the wing. So if you catch them in flight, they just have it's just such a gorgeous powdery blue patch. The drake and his lovely breeding plumage um, has this really distinct white crescent on the front of his face. It is very, very large. It goes from the top of the head down to the base of, a little bit of the throat-ish area, but it's quite broad. And if you're new to this, you'll hear me say this a lot. Really focus on where the white is when you're trying to locate or try to identify ducks, especially at a distance. White is really, really going to stand out. A lot of the other colors, especially as it's getting dusky and the light is getting, not so ideal, you tend to lose all of the color cues, but white really, really does stand out. They've got a nice dark rump with a little white patch on it. Otherwise, their breast and flanks are kind of spotted and speckly. They're just a handsome, tidy little duck. Their head is this kind of really dark bluish, but there's almost a little bit of a purple iridescence if you get them in the right light. They're just such a handsome little guy. Nice, dark bill on them and in flight, showing that bright powdery blue patch. The males have a nice big strip of white, and the speculum patch, which is the secondary feathers here in the drake, is going to be kind of this iridescent green in the center. There'll be black feathers around, but that kind of the core of it is this nice iridescent green. So a super handsome little duck. The hen, she's a little bit trickier. On the whole, these are small ducks. Are going to be quite a fair bit smaller than, say, something like a mallard that you might be used to seeing. So mottled brown, all of the dabbling duck hens are mottled brown. That's because they nest in the upland vegetation and they want to, they want to have feather patterning that mimics the vegetation around them as they're sitting on eggs. So mottled brown overall, but what you really want to take a look at here is the face and bill. So one, she has a nice dark bill, so that'll separate out all kinds of some of the larger species like the shoveler that's going to have a spatulate bill that's a bit more you know, olivey olivey orange color, and the mallards and the gadwalls will have orange on it. Blue-winged teal, nice solid dark bill. And on the face, what we want to be paying attention to is these little eye arcs. So take a look at the eye, and we'll compare blue-winged teal and green-winged teal so you can get a good side-by-side comparison. But these little eye arcs, they tend to make the eye look a little bit bigger. And the base of the bill has usually some amount of white feathering, or it's overall much more pale than the rest of the head. So it looks pale towards the base of the bill. Of course, if, she's holding her wings in a certain way, you might be able to see some of that kind of forewing patch, that powdery blue there, but don't bank on it. They don't always show that. Maybe if they're stretching or they're, tootling around on land and you just happen to catch them move their wings, so you might be able to see that. But what we really want to do is focus right in on the face. A dark bill, kind of pale eye arcs. It doesn't make a complete ring around the eye, but she's got arcs above and below, and that pale base of the bill. There is a bit of a faint dark eyeline. You're going to see that on a lot of female ducks. Okay, and I see this. This is good timing because somebody brought this up in the questions. Somebody asked, "What is the eclipse plumage of a duck?" And males will go through an eclipse plumage when they are molting, and they do this because ducks molt all of their flight feathers all at once. And so during this time, the males will renew all of their feathers, but they'll temporarily take on the look of the female for the most part. There's still some clues, and you can see in this photo, I've split it apart. They were stacked above and below, but it is from a single shot of a hen and an eclipse drake in flight. You can really see the wing patch on the hen, nice and kind of, more subdued blue. The speculum, it's dark. We're not really seeing any green, but you can tell this one is a drake in eclipse plumage because it has that bold blue wing patch, that bold white section here, and that speculum patch is still showing the green. So he still does have a little bit of a pop and a flash of color, but overall, you can see his face. It looks an awful lot like the hen's or the female's face. So that eclipse plumage really is to, make them less flashy to predators. The last thing you want as a duck, if you can't fly, is to be waving around a great big sign saying, "Hey, I'm over here." And, some predator comes by and lo and behold, the duck can't get away. So they do, for a period of time, want to blend in. And they'll start to do this kind of late mid to late July. They'll start to, head out to, lakes that are more secluded, that are harder for people and, predators to get to. And then they'll, molt their flight feathers. They'll be looking more like a female. And then it takes time. So they're going to spend a fair bit of the fall in this eclipse plumage. Eventually they'll get back to looking, like their usual bold selves. But this is a really nice example of eclipse plumage drake looking a fair bit like the hen, but still having that pop of color. What do these guys eat? They're a pretty opportunistic dabbler. Like a lot of things, they're going to be going after aquatic invertebrates because invertebrates, especially, during the season where they're building up stores to lay all of the eggs, all of that protein becomes really, really important. And there's, no better way really for them, these guys anyway, than to get it from a lot of aquatic invertebrates. They'll eat aquatic vegetation, as you can see this hen here with her little messy bill full of duckweed and her little breast there covered in duckweed. I think it's absolutely adorable. Other algae, they'll also eat agricultural grains, especially in the fall. Dabbling ducks have their legs set kind of in the middle of their body, so they're less awkward than their diving counterparts. They can walk around and graze on land. And they make this little pip, pip, pip call. It's rather soft. Blue-winged teal, they've got quite the broad distribution across Canada and the US. This is a species that you're likely to encounter almost anywhere you might be tuning in from. Even in Vancouver, you might be out of luck on if you're in Victoria, but you're going to be encountering blue-winged teal for the most part across Canada and the US. Okay, next up, we have the green-winged teal. This is our smallest dabbling duck. It is teeny tiny. They are very adorable. They're more compact and smaller than the blue-winged teal, but, it perhaps isn't, the most striking thing because they're both rather small. They tend to have a smaller head overall and a smaller bill than their blue-winged teal counterparts. And the drakes are just, they're so handsome. They're really lovely. One of the key things to hone in on is that white spur up the side of this little flank. It really stands out great at a distance. They have this kind of creamy white triangle on their rear end that's kind of bordered in black. It's got a bit of that creamy, buffy color to it, so it doesn't stand out quite as brightly as the white spur, but it still does stand out. And that head, they are so gorgeous. So it's a kind of a cinnamon, rusty head with this dramatic kind of green eyeshadow that goes back from the eye down the back of the neck. Their flank is kind of this, you know, variegated black and white that gives a gray appearance, and their breast is kind of straw colored and speckly. They're just a handsome little duck. Um, they don't have quite the flashy wing pattern that their blue-winged teal cousins have, so they don't really have any of that patch on the forewing here, but they do still have a really nice, iridescent green speculum. It's more half and half, so closer to the body, the secondary colors are this iridescent green. Closer to the wingtip, they get nice and dark, and there's a little bit of a white or kind of a straw-colored buffy stripe above and below, and the hen's wing looks much the same. Let's get to her. These are hard photos to source. Green-winged teal hens, they are small, they are skulky, there's just not always a ton of great photos, and it's always a struggle to try to get really good photos of this species. So the hen is quite tiny. Again, she has that kind of compact look overall. And once you get used to looking at ducks, you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about when I say it's a compact looking duck. It doesn't have a terribly long neck, doesn't have elegant proportions or anything, so kind of really looks like a compact little duck. Of course, mottled brown overall. And it took me years to realize this, and it was only kind of putting some of these workshops together that I realized green-winged teal, their hens, they have a nice little white or creamish stripe kind of at the very back of the flank going towards the tail. And that's often visible as the bird is sitting there floating around on the water. It's really hidden in this one who's standing up on, the shoreline of the water. You can still sort of see it, but it is really, a lot more evident as the bird is sitting around floating on the water. So that cream patch is really, really helpful. See a small brown duck, take a look at the rear end and see if there's that cream patch. Otherwise, when we were looking at the face of the blue-winged teal, we were noting how, it's got some of those pale features to it around the base of the bill. The green-winged teal is the opposite. All of the features on her face are going to be making the face look kind of just plain and dark overall. The bill is quite dark, and she's got that dark eye line through it, but there's no pale eye arcs. There's no paleness at the base of the bill. And so that really kind of does stand out. Small little brown duck with just a dark looking face overall. It's still mottled in brown, but it doesn't have any of those lighter tones to it. And that speculum patch you can see as well in these two photos that she's showing us very nicely here. Still quite iridescent and lovely. This is another opportunistic dabbler. They're going to be eating sedges and grasses. And if you remember from last week, we were talking about sedges. They have edges. A cross section of the leaf is going to show kind of like a W shape, and they're really kind of rigid. They eat other aquatic vegetation, of course, insects and larvae, crustaceans, and mollusks. Now, the drakes can have a little bit of a crest behind the head, but they don't always show that. So sometimes you can see it a little bit, other times it just looks like a regular old rounded head. So don't hone in on something like that because you don't always see it. And they make a nice little peep noise. It's not quite the little soft pip pip pips, but it's quite a much louder peep. And that is one that you can hear at a bit more of a distance. Those soft pip pip pips like the blue-winged teal were doing, you're not going to hear that over any sort of distance. It's got to be right in the wetland near you or maybe flying over you. It doesn't really travel very well, but the peep of the green-winged teal does travel a decent amount. So I'll play it once more. This peep, peep. Okay. Green-winged teal is another teal that you are likely to see across, a great swath of Canada and the US. Okay, let's compare those teal hens because for me, I'm telling you, it took years of being able to, tell them apart reliably. It is tricky, and if you get to the point where you're like, I know it's a teal hen, you've already sorted out so many of the other possibilities. And I think of, a lot of bird ID is learning how to get close. And then as you gain more practice, you'll be able to sort out those kind of close groupings a little bit better. So don't stress out if you go, oh my gosh, teal hens, that is beyond me. That's okay. It is not an easy thing. So blue-winged teal, we're going to take a look at the face for both of these species. Blue-winged teal has those nice little white eye arcs and palish feathers at the base of the bill, giving an overall paler look to the face. The green-winged teal, she's going to have a much darker face. There's going to be none of those lovely little eye arcs, and there really isn't any whitish feathering at the base of the bill. So overall, the head looks dark. They're both small ducks. They both have a dark bill. The green-winged teal does look a bit more compact, has a shorter body length. Somebody mentioned in the chat, it's got like a bit of a blocky head. They're not really, like I said, they're not terribly elegantly proportioned. They're sturdy, compact little ducks. And if all else fails, take a look at the rear end because you will oftentimes, especially if you're seeing them on the water, you'll be able to see this little whitish or cream patch. Here, this female's got more of a whitish patch, but it can be white or it can be cream looking. Like I said, it took me years to figure that out. I don't know why it eluded me for probably 15 plus years. But that's a pretty helpful way to tell those two species apart. And again, if you're thinking, my gosh, teal hens are difficult, don't worry about it, and you can come back next year and try to learn them again. Okay, moving along to a couple of grebes. We'll start off first with the horned grebe. These guys are really cute and very, very handsome. Both sexes look similar in that they've got this dark head that's kind of blocky and chunky, and the feathers really are they kind of like lift off from the rest of the neck. So it looks like there's maybe a bobblehead stuck on top of a duck's body or a grebe's body. It really doesn't look like it connects terribly well. So blackish head, and they have these yellow or golden eyebrow stripes, and they're really they're dense, they're thick. Overall, this small grebe has a flat topped head, and they'll be coming in handy when we're comparing the eared grebe. Head shape is really important here. Overall, fairly small bill. If you get to see that red eye, it is really fascinating. Like reddish, and right around the iris is this kind of like yellowish part to it. It's just it looks almost terrifying if you stare at it too long. They do have a rufous neck and rufous flanks, and otherwise their kind of body is this blackish gray color. But that reddish color and that grayish color, they're so close in value that you know if you're seeing this bird at a distance or in any kind of poor lighting, it's all going to blend in. And we'll see when we compare to the eared grebe. It has an all black neck. I don't recommend you look for that feature specifically. It can be useful for supporting, but just know that in kind of poor light conditions, or if the bird is really distant, that kind of grayish and blackish can really start to look like just one color. If you do happen to see them preening, they have this bright white little belly. It is very, very cute. And usually the males are brighter and larger, but you can't always tell. So in this example down here, there really is quite a striking difference between the male on the left-hand side and the female on the right-hand side. Her eyebrow is really, very, very pale. It's not that kind of golden yellow color, but I've seen a lot of pairs that you really can't tell the difference between them. Maybe you can see the size difference, but most of the time, that eyebrow looks the same. So just so you know, you might not be able to notice that. And this is a grebe that you're going to find on small ponds in pairs. They're quite territorial. They don't want to share their small pond, with another pair of horned grebes. So you'll often see them on quite small little ponds, especially, some of these smaller pothole wetlands like we have here on the prairies. You'll find them in some of the smaller ones that are maybe just a little too small for something like a pied-billed grebe. They have kind of a central, western, and northern distribution in Canada and the US. So if you're back east, you're going to have to travel west if you want to get good looks at horned grebes during the breeding season. You might get them through in passage, and along the coast, you'll see them in winter in their non-breeding flumages. But if you really want to see the spectacularness of them, you'll have to come out a little bit further west. But they're quite common, across a fair bit of the prairie provinces and getting up into the Northwest Territories. I was surprised because I was on a trip in far northern Saskatchewan and I saw so many pairs of horned grebes on just these tiny little ponds in the landscape, and I hadn't seen them in the boreal forest, and so it was interesting to see them as the boreal turned into the taiga and the trees were more sparse. So quite a wide-ranging species. They are a diver, as I mentioned, and last week we covered, kind of characteristics of grebes. They really do, dive well. They're well built for life, seeking food underwater. They're going to be eating a lot of aquatic insects and larvae in the summertime, and this is partially because they do choose those small ponds. And in the winter, those small ponds, they freeze right to the bottom. So most of them are non-fish bearing. I'm sure they would love to eat the fish if they were in their nice small ponds, but by and large, a lot of those small ponds, they can't support fish over the winter. They do eat a fair bit of fish in the winter as well as crustaceans, but on the breeding grounds, most of those ponds cannot support fish life. I mean, they could for the summer, but you would lose them all in the winter. As we talked about last week, grebes have fantastic and elaborate courtship rituals, and here are a couple of photos of some of those postures for the horned grebe. We've got the penguin dance, where they get up on their hind legs and they push themselves up out of the water, and then they'll bump their breasts and they'll point their heads at one another, and they'll do all these stylized kind of looking back and forth and synchronized preening, like I'm going to preen my left shoulder, I'll preen my left shoulder. It is absolutely adorable. And here's an example of the weed ceremony where they've both gone underwater, collected aquatic vegetation to kind of say, like, hey, look how much vegetation I can pick. I am going to be a great nest building partner for you. You should choose me. And they help do that to reinforce their pair bond as well. This is a species that you're not really likely to hear a whole lot. They're vocal in the really early spring and then again in the late summer. But when most other species are vocal, these guys tend to be fairly silent. So in all of the bird surveys I've done during the breeding season, I have never actually heard horned grebes. It's only kind of before and after. So they're a little bit of an outlier, at least in my experience that way. And they have this kind of light, raspy, whinny braying call. So cute little noises. It really sounds like they're forcing to get it out. Like maybe they've lost their voice or something and they're really, still trying to scream at a concert or, baseball game or something. And I'll just take a second to compare that to the redneck grebe that we heard last week that has a similar kind of braying, but it's much more robust and it definitely travels a long way. And you will hear this a fair bit during the breeding season if you have them near you. Oops, disappeared just as I clicked. And we'll just compare that again to the horned grebe, which is raspy whinny. Okay, next up, we're going to compare that to the eared grebe. And the eared grebe is another small-sized grebe, and it has small pointy bill, and it's overall a similar color where we've got the dark blackish grayish colors as well as some rustiness. So they've got rustiness on the flank, but their neck is all black. And again, at a distance, that's really going to be tough to see. They have, however, a triangular head shape. They really, if you see them out at a distance and you take a look at the bottom photos here, it actually becomes clearer the farther away they are, just how pointy the tops of their heads are. They really look like a nice little triangle. They too have a red eye. Both sexes look the same. And instead of that kind of thick, chunky eyebrow that the horned grebe has, the eared grebes have these kind of wispy yellow plumes. They're not quite as solid and chunky. There's the odd time where, because they do a lot of diving underwater, they can get wet and a little bit clumpy, but they're always, a bit more spread out, behind the eye on the back of the bird's head. So nice little wispy plumes. They too have a white belly if they decide to show it to you, but the triangular pointy head is really, really, really going to be the thing that makes them stand out. You'll find these guys in shallow wetlands, and I do mean shallow. I've seen them on wetlands that can't be more than 2 feet deep. Some of them just look like a barely flooded field, and you'll see eared grebes there. And they are colonial species, so you'll almost never just see one or two eared grebes. You're usually looking at a group, and group sizes can range, 12, 20 or so to I've seen areas with hundreds of them in one colony. And so they'll nest close to one another. They really, enjoy that kind of communal life. Whereas the horned grebes, you're always going to see those two together as a pair on a small pond somewhere without any other grebe neighbors. So that is kind of a behavioral clue. So if you're thinking like, ooh, Leanne was talking about small dark grebes, and I'm seeing a lot of them right now, that's likely an eared grebe. The exception is on migration. You'll get horned grebes staging in the centers of lakes, but you got to be out there really, really early in the season. But on the breeding grounds during the breeding season, so kind of June and July, these guys are going to be hanging out in groups, and they're very, very adorable with that little triangular pointy head. Here's some examples of their colonial nesting habits, and really that a lot of these wetlands, they are not terribly deep, especially this one on the top here. That is not a very deep wetland. I took the photo on the bottom. That one was about, thigh deep, but they also don't mind co-nesting with other species. I've highlighted some nests of Franklin's gulls around it and the three-eared grebe nests in the middle. So they're not afraid of neighbors. They seem to enjoy it. They're another diving species, and of course, they're going to be eating aquatic insects and larvae. They'll also eat small shrimp, some of these like brine shrimp that you get in some of the saltier water bodies. And if they happen to be on a bigger water body, or especially on the wintering grounds, they're going to be eating small fish and mollusks. And they make this cute little noise like powichik, powichik. Very, very cute noises. So a little bit more melodic than some of those other grebe calls that we've been hearing. So powichik, powichik. And sometimes if you get a group of them going, you can just kind of hear the din of it out, out on a wetland. Play that once more for you. I don't know if you could hear, but there's a coot grunting in the background of there. Okay, this is another species that really has kind of a central distribution. So Great Plains in Canada, they're up into little parts of BC as well, and in the northern Great Plains. So if you're out east, you're kind of out of luck for seeing these guys unless you travel farther center and farther west. Okay, so let's compare the two side by side because they are both very similar looking grebes. They're both very similar in size. They have a little bit of a difference in structure, which is kind of, one of the keys to identifying them. That triangular pointy head that the eared grebes have, and the more flattened head that the horned grebes have. I know that it goes up a little bit at the back, but it's really not that kind of equilateral triangle looking head that the eared grebes have. So triangular head for the eared grebe, flat topped, kind of blocky looking head for the horned grebe. It really does look like somebody put a bobblehead on its body. Wispy yellow plumes for the eared grebe, and solid yellow eyebrow patch for the horned grebe. And again, that colonial behavior of the eared grebes, you're often going to see these guys in groups on the breeding season, and horned grebe, you will just find them in pairs. Again, they will migrate in groups, but once everybody's staking out some territory, they're staking out their own pond, and it can be surprisingly small sometimes. So just to drive home the point of you can really tell just by shape, I've blocked them out for you just looking at the shape. You can imagine if you squint your eyes at the screen a little bit, that triangular pointy head really does stand out at a distance, and that more flat-topped head of the horned grebe, combined with, if you're seeing lots of them all at once during the breeding season, that'll point you to eared grebe with little pointy heads, flat-topped head for the horned grebe, solo in pairs. Okay. Next up, we are changing gears. We are going to a shorebird called the Wilson snipe, formerly called the common snipe. Maybe it'll go back to common again, who knows. So this is a snipe that is really common around wetlands, even ones that are mostly just kind of damp soil. There might not be some big open water. There might just be really kind of a damp, marshy meadow kind of area around. Medium-sized shorebird, they're kind of chunky, and they have this just absurdly long straight bill for the size of their body. They have a really chunky body shape. They do have a neck, I assure you, but for the most part, they're they're holding it close, so it kind of looks like somebody just took a scoop of ice cream on top of a bird and they called that the head. So it really doesn't look like there's a whole lot of neck going on a lot of the time when you're seeing this bird. Like, this is really kind of the classic posture. If you do get lucky enough to see one, they'll often perch up and call. They tend to keep that head tucked in. So that really long, straight bill, chunky body. Got nice, shorebirdie legs, but really chunky overall. Both sexes look the same. They're both mottled brown overall, and they have these pale, buffy white stripes down the back. So if you get a look over on the top of them or from behind, you can see these nice kind of long stripes running down their back. And they do have really big eyes, and that allows them to see, both in front of them and almost all the way behind them. They have a massive amount of, peripheral vision where they can see. So they're something that's going to be tough to sneak up on. And they have these nice little stripes on the head. And again, you'll find them in areas where you have wetlands, especially shallow wetlands with damp soil habitats. They will nest in kind of those damp soil areas. They won't quite nest in the upland. They want it to be closer to the where that soil gets kind of bogged down and, kind of permanently wet, but not in standing water. And as you can imagine, if there's, flooding, their eggs are going to be severely at risk because they kind of straddle that line between wet and dry. They have really neat feeding behaviors. So this is a bird that probes deep into wet soil, mud, and shallow water with that long bill. And what's cool about some of these shorebirds that have these long probing bills like that is that they actually have little cells on the tips and the sides of them that can sense pressure and movement. So they're probing with that bill, but it's kind of like if we were to be probing with our finger, we could sense if there was, a worm wriggling past our finger. They're doing much the same with that bill. And, if they sense that, a worm or a crustacean or something is there, then they can, quickly nab it without ever laying eyes on it. So they really are going around and feeling with that bill. I just find that really fascinating about some of these probing shorebirds. They're going after larval insects, earthworms, crustaceans, and mollusks. And one of the cool things is their flight display. They give this beautiful winnowing noise. And I say noise because it's not a song or a call. They're not vocalizing. It's actually these tail feathers here. They're offset, as you can see from the rest of the tail. Looks nice and orderly like a regular tail. However, they have these special feathers right on the edge of their tail. And what they do in their flight display is that they'll fly really high, and then they will dive at a, really fast rate and swoop up. And the air going over those tail feathers at those speeds actually makes that winnowing sound. So I'll play that for you here. I find those non-vocalization sounds kind of fascinating. So here's the winnowing flight display sound. You can hear it gets closer and closer, and then it backs off again. which is pretty neat, right? And so if you're out there standing, and they do this, is they'll do it at many times a day, but dawn and dusk are really active for them. And it's funny to just stand there because they get hard to count, especially when your job is counting birds, like mine is a lot of the time. You might be standing there, and because the birds they're just moving so much, you're listening for overlapping winnows because they move so much, and it is really really interesting to kind of hear it go. And it starts off farther away, it comes close, and then tapers off again. It's so neat. And they're, yeah, I just think they're really cool little birds. Somebody mentioned in the chat if they're related to woodcocks, and they are. We don't really get woodcocks this far west. We do have the odd one that shows up in Saskatchewan every now and then. We had a few during the breeding bird atlas, but yeah, they're very similar. And if you're familiar with woodcocks, different plumage pattern, but very much the same kind of shape and body structure. Woodcocks, they do probably the best kind of mating dance display, and I highly recommend after this webinar is over that you go to YouTube and you just, I promise it won't show up anything weird if you Google woodcock, all one word. You can add bird for extra safety, but they do this fantastic display. They do, it almost looks like Michael Jackson moves. It's absolutely hysterical. So that's your, maybe that's your homework for the evening after the webinar is over. Um, Another vocalization they do, and this one actually is a vocalization. It's a kek 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 call. So it kind of sounds like a squeaky wheel, and it goes at intervals. And they'll often do this from a perch, so it sounds like it's coming from one place and not multiple, like the winnow. So here's a kek kek kek. It really does sound like a squeaky wheel that might be in need of some oil. So let's play the winnow again for you. It was pretty neat, and it's a sound that you can hear quite a ways away, in part because they're up in the air doing it. You know, there's not all that vegetation and stuff to get in the way and eat the sound waves. They really, they get up high and they do this, so it travels a fair ways. The kek 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 call also travels pretty good because it's quite a, it's a good pitch for that, but the winnow is really the one that is kind of spectacular. And luckily, if you think the Wilson snipe is a pretty cool bird, and if you live in Canada, you're almost guaranteed to see it, unless you're up in the tundra biome. So, you'll find them across Canada and across a good chunk of the US as well. And last but not least, this is my favorite tern. So terns are related to gulls, and think of them as, you're imagining gulls like ring-billed gull, that you see oftentimes at the beach or often in parking lots, that sort of thing. Terns are like their sleeker, sexier cousins. They're more, they just have, they're less bulky. They're more sleek, elegant. They have pointier wings, and oftentimes they're a little bit smaller, though you can get some really large terns. The black tern is a small tern as far as terns go. It has a straight little black bill, narrow wings, so it doesn't have those big bulky wings like a lot of the gulls have. And both sexes look the same, and they really stand out because they have this just jet black body. It just kind of eats the light. It is just such a pure dark black that you don't often see. And their wings, especially in flight, especially below, they're kind of this silvery gray color. There's a little bit of black on the tops of them, but they fly around and they have this erratic, buoyant flight. They fly in some ways almost like a butterfly does. It's kind of, they kind of float and flop around in the air, and their tail has this silvery color to it, as do their wings. And so they stand out. There isn't another bird that looks like them in this area. So super, super handsome. This is another colonial nesting species, so they're going to be nesting in groups. It could be a small group or it could be a group of hundreds. They prefer kind of shallow marshes, and they actually build their nest on floating vegetation. So they are one of the species that are kind of prone to losing their nest and eggs to wave action. And so this can be an issue on larger lakes, because oftentimes you'll have like kind of a bit of a backwater part of the lake where there's some vegetation, and if there's terns nesting there and somebody goes by, say on a skidoo or a boat, and they're creating a big wake, their eggs and nests are at risk of getting flooded. And I've seen, tern eggs just flooded out and, floating along. Those eggs are a loss. But they do, again, it's one of those nests that is really in one of those kind of high risk tricky areas. It's great because they're not really at risk of a lot of predators. They're hard to get to, but it does put them at risk of kind of bigger wave action. Oftentimes, because they're floating, or they're attached to vegetation that's floating, they can, the nest platform will go up and down if in case there's any like changes in water level. So it's not so much, ooh, there's a big rain event and the water levels have gone up. For the most part, their eggs are kind of safe. Not like the grebes that build their mounds. Those are kind of fixed and they're built from the floor of the wetland up. Those guys are at risk, say if it floods really bad. Anyway, so black terns are one of those ones that might be at risk if there's a lot of boating and wake generation, if they happen to be nesting in an area that has a lot of boat traffic. They forage in wetlands, and they kind of really elegantly scoop and pluck little things from the water's surface. So they'll fly often really low over the wetland in search of insects, small fish. If they're at the top of the water, they're not going to dive. They don't do like some of the terns do, where they plunge headfirst into the water after fish. They really pluck things off the surface of the water. So they'll go for snails. If they can find the odd small frog and tadpole, they'll eat those too. And they can fly a really long distance in search for food. We have a colleague who works for the Canadian Wildlife Service who's been tracking some of them. And I think she said one of her birds that was tracked was known to go about 80 kilometers, in a single foraging flight. So it's pretty incredible in terms of how far they can travel to go and get food. And in terms of sounds, you'll often hear them because they travel and they move over large distances. You'll be hanging out at a wetland, and all of a sudden you'll hear this call coming, and then next thing you know, there's 10 black terns foraging around, and a couple of minutes later they've moved on to a different wetland. So they have kind of harsh squawks, and to me, it sounds like maybe they've swallowed a dog squeaky toy. So yeah, really kind of a harsh squeaky noise. I totally think it sounds like as though they've swallowed a squeaky toy. So if you can keep that in mind, that'll tip you off. But the noise suddenly from somewhere usually tips you off to go look in that direction anyway. And so you'll see this, just they're so elegant, they're so beautiful. That jet black body and those kind of silvery wings, and just this kind of buoyant, erratic flight. And oftentimes, if you're seeing one, keep an eye out. You're likely going to see several more of them, and they could be nesting, quite a ways away, and they will travel a far distance to forage. Fairly widespread, Canada and the northern U.S. I'm seeing in the chat here, they're an at-risk bird in Michigan. So you might be inclined to get out and see these guys, because they're just so adorable. I do love them. Okay, got a couple of amphibians coming up, and those of you who are in the east, this species is going to be, more familiar to you. They just kind of get into Manitoba, and during the Breeding Bird Atlas, we had crews up on Reindeer Lake in kind of northern Saskatchewan. So if you're familiar with that lake at all, we actually had crews kind of in that area hearing spring peepers, which was really cool. And I think that was probably the first record for spring peeper in the province. So kind of exciting. in some of those areas where we just don't have a lot of surveying or anybody reporting on what species they're hearing. It's always cool to add another dot to a range map. So spring peepers are quite tiny in terms of frogs, so about 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch long. And if you've noticed anything, the background color of frogs is kind of highly variable, but we're mostly going to be focusing on markings. And spring peepers really conveniently have this kind of X that grows across the back. We got two lines that kind of start behind the eye-ish and they cross over at the midpoint of the body and they head down to kind of the mid-thigh area. This one's a little bit more broken up, but he's still got this nice little X on his back. They are so tough to actually see. I've only ever seen a handful of them myself. This little guy here was on a raspberry leaf. It was so small. They really enjoy wooded ponds, and they're going to often be found on vegetation near those wooded ponds. So they're not going to be hanging out in the water a ton, but there'll be, just hanging out on some of that dewy, moist vegetation. And they also make peeping noises, but they're very, very loud. And oftentimes, when you get them going, you'll get them going like right as spring melts, occurring. You might, if you go out and you're in Eastern Canada right now, you might be far along enough in spring that the spring peepers are going. They'll often do this kind of in the evenings or early mornings. So let's hear those peeping noises, and it is absolutely outsized in terms of volume for the size of frog that they are. So it really, creates a massive chorus, especially at nighttime. You can hear these guys going. So if you're out, back east, or if you're in eastern Manitoba, give a listen if you happen, to be out on, if you have some property that's kind of not in the middle of a city, give a listen. As that spring meltwater comes out, there can still be snow on the ground, and as soon as the frogs thaw out, essentially, they're gonna start their calling. So they're probably singing right now in eastern Canada and the eastern U.S. Okay, next up we have tree frogs, and there's two species of tree frogs that overlap a lot in distribution. And as I alluded to, they're extremely similar. They're gray tree frog and Cope's gray tree frog. And the difference between the two is largely genetic. In terms of, visuals, it's almost impossible to tell them apart. Um, but the gray tree frog has the regular number of chromosomes. It's diploid. Um, most animals are diploid. You and I are diploid, which means we have two sets of chromosomes in our cells. And the Cope's gray tree frog is tetraploid, meaning that it has four sets of chromosomes. This can happen in um, cell division as they're dividing the, in a mother organism as she's dividing the cells for the eggs. Sometimes it appears that occasionally one egg will be produced with four sets of the chromosomes, and somehow this results in viable offspring that are unable to breed back with the haploid individual. So it kind of creates a different species. And if you know plants and plant genetics at all, plants have all kinds of wild amounts of chromosomes. Mammals and animals in general were much more tame in that regard. And so the difference is genetic. There is a difference in the call, but they overlap wildly in terms of location that they're found in, as well as look to them. And you can see these tree frogs really do like come in a wide variety of colors and patterns. They are tree frogs, so they do climb, and you can see these little enlarged toe pads on them that have these little ridges, which make them really able to stick to, everything from glass to tree bark, leaves, all sorts of things. So they're a climbing species. They're not one that you're going to find in the wetland. They're small to medium size, and if they do happen to crawl on your window or you get a look at them hopping, they have kind of this yellow coloration on their back thighs, so it's really quite cute. Um, the gray tree frog, the call, um, they're both flat pitched. They don't rise or decrease in pitch. The gray, you can hear the pulses of the whirring more, and the Cope's gray tree frog is more of a monotonous buzz. You can hear the pulses of the individual little calls that make up the call less distinctly. So let's listen to it because I'm not doing it justice here. Okay, the gray tree frog with the whirring. See if you can hear the pulses. Kind of warbly. Oops. And let's listen to the Cope's gray tree frog here. Much more of a burr. It sounds, a little bit different than the gray. I wonder if I can play them both at the same time. So the whir really has more of that kind of pulsiness to it, and the burrs of the Cope's gray tree frog really just sounds more of a burr, burr. I'm seeing a question, can they reproduce within the species once it's created? They can. And so I don't know exactly how all of that happens, that enough of them are made that they can breed and, go off and create a species that's mostly identical but slightly different in that it has more chromosomes. Somehow it happens. It's one of those fascinating quirks, and I'm not an expert in amphibians by any means, and so I'm sure someone who's a real expert in amphibians and amphibian genetics can explain more of it. Salamanders have wild genetics. That's all I know about them. So those are the tree frogs. They're much more of an eastern species. You will get them a fair bit in Manitoba. I haven't heard or seen any in Saskatchewan yet, but who knows? Maybe, the odd one is waiting to be discovered in some of the backwoods forests that most folks don't get out to. So those are the tree frogs, and they're very adorable, and I hope you get to see one because they look kind of just like a lump. They're very cute. They look kind of chubby. I just think they're quite adorable. I've got a little listening thing for you here because boreal chorus frog sort of sounds similar, especially to the gray tree frog, and I did manage to find a recording of both of them. So what I'm showing you here is a spectrogram of the audio file. And what this is, it's time on this axis, on the x-axis, it's frequency on the y-axis. So the boreal chorus frog is a little higher pitched than the Cope's gray tree frog, which is lower pitched. And the brightness gives you an idea for how loud a particular sound is. If you're wondering what these little hash marks in the background are, those are crickets. So the boreal chorus frog, remember that's the one that sounds like you're running your thumbnail over the teeth of a comb, and especially if you're going towards the end that has the shorter and shorter teeth on it, the pitch kind of rises. Whereas the Cope's gray tree frog, it really has more of a flat pitch. So let's play it a couple of times here. Okay, let's play that once more for you. You can follow that little play line as you go. So I'm going to upload this one. There's my 8 o'clock alarm. I'm going to upload this one online as well. And I might do a few more of these spectrograms because, you know, they can be helpful for trying to visualize the sounds that you're hearing. Some people love them, some people find them very confusing. I work with a lot of bird sounds, and when we're listening to recordings, we're actually watching at the same time. And sometimes it's actually easier to pick things out visually than it is to hear them. So I'll look to try to do a few of those as well. It's a bit tricky to try to record the screen and record the audio at the same time. So I'll see what I can do to make it happen to try to, bring a few more of those into the mix as well. So we'll go for a quick review. Today we covered blue-winged teal and green-winged teal. The Drake blue-winged teal has that lovely white crescent in front of its face, and the male green-winged teal has this white spur. We've got soft little pip, pip, pip noises of the blue-winged teal. So soft little pipping noises, sound's not going to travel far. Green-winged teal, much more of a loud peep. And just because we covered the spring peeper, I'll just play it right after here because it does sound a little bit different. It almost just sounds a little bit more magical than the green-winged teal. And you'll often hear it in a larger chorus. Oftentimes there'll be several peepers going, and you won't often, especially in kind of a forested setting where there's just kind of maybe a shallow spring pond, you're not going to be having the green-winged teal there necessarily. We also covered the two grebes, horned grebe and eared grebe. Horned grebe with more of that flat, blocky head with that really bold eye stripe with a, kind of a eyebrow there. And the eared grebe has a much more pointy little head and those wispy plumes behind the eye. Horned grebe, you'll see these guys in pairs on small ponds during the breeding season and has a much more raspy whinnying call. For the most part, it really sounds like it's forcing out the calls, like it's lost its voice at a concert and it's still trying to call, but it really does sound more forced, and it's not as loud, it's not as clear as the redneck grebe that we covered last week. Let's play the redneck grebe just for comparison here. So it's a much louder call. You'll have redneck grebes on much larger bodies of water, by and large, so a little bit different sounding. The eared grebes also go poo-wee-chick, poo-wee-chick. And we covered the Wilson snipe, which has that beautiful winnowing flight display. And that keck, keck, keck squeaky wheel call. Yeah, I'm envisioning a kid like on a rusty tricycle or something, really pedaling as much as he can, and boy, that thing needs an oiling. And black tern has those harsh squawks, sounds like it might have swallowed a dog chew toy. Okay, and last but not least, those frogs, the spring peeper, those teeny tiny little guys with the X on the back, and those very loud peeps. and just compare it quickly again to the green-winged teal, which has a peep, peep. And last but not least, our genetically complicated tree frogs, the gray and Cope's gray. So the gray has those whirring calls, and you can hear the pulses, and the Cope's is more of a burr and a buzzy flat tone call. And I can see that I've got gray spelt both the American and Canadian way in this presentation. Part of that is because for birds, the standard is generally the American spelling. So clay-colored sparrow, we're spelling that without the U. That's just the established English common name for them. And I don't know if it's as hard and fast as it is for amphibians, and I'm sure it's because I came across them spelled two different ways that I wound up writing two different ways here. So anyway, for birds, we're often using the American spelling because that's the American Ornithological Union standard that the Americas uses. Okay, that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank you guys all for tuning in. You can reach out to me at llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. The MarshWatch page link is up there. You can follow Birds Canada on all of the socials, and we are a not-for-profit, and if you do give regularly to charitable organizations, I hope you'll consider, donating to Birds Canada to help us continue the work that we do. I'd like to thank the supporters of MarshWatch. These are organizations that grant us funds to, create and carry out this work. So those are the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and the Wildlife Habitat Canada.